I came here as an academic, so I'm used to going to academic conferences, and I find actually the way we've let academic conferences become both highly superficial and highly boring in many of the formal aspects, right? So informally, these academic conferences can be very fruitful, very enriching, very pleasurable in all different kinds of ways, but at the formal level, pretty much everybody agrees that much of what happens is in fact deadly boring, is not innovative or cutting edge, is not changing what we know or what we think, and that a lot of that kind of stuff takes place in other spaces and in other ways. And so I was very interested in seeing if I could experience something that worked differently from that, and what I could take from this in terms of that question of how is it that you work together with people to create new ideas and new possibilities. And I think that's what I'm very interested in. I think we're living, it's sort of embedded in a larger thing, that I think we're living in a transitional moment. It's very clear. We have institutions, we have ideas, we have academic disciplines, we have organizations that all came together, that were given shape and that came of age in a different time period, where the most sort of the very much hegemonic political structure was the nation state. So something like democracy, say, could be really treated as something that takes place within the national sphere, while at the same time you treat the international sphere as a domain in which there's completely different rules, and that this was a way actually of solving a problem rather than creating one. So nowadays, where you have many new routes of migration, many new migratory populations and so forth living in places that didn't anticipate them and that aren't experienced in them, or that are being overwhelmed by them, right? Then what happens is that global conflicts, global developments and so forth become very much a part of the domestic, national, democratic domain. So we have democratic systems that were set up to solve national problems, but time and again, right, economically, culturally, socially, educationally, right, the challenges that they're encountering are in fact ones that cannot be solved at the national level. And so we're having a crisis of democracy in that sense, that the tools we have at hand aren't adequate to the situation. And that's the case in every field that I look at. So if I'm looking at the field of religion, the conceptions that we have of it, the structures that we have for it, and so forth, are also tremendously under pressure and shifting in ways that we can't actually put into words. If you look at something like cities, same thing is happening to cities relative to neoliberalization, migration, and so forth. We're creating these world cities, some of which have more power or more populations or different dynamics than nation states. So if we're looking at the environment, so right, you could keep going on, but in essentially every sphere we look at, we're seeing that it's under pressure from changes that we don't yet in fact have the tools to address. So I'm very interested in situations like this, where the purpose is very much to try and do some kind of out-of-the-box thinking that creates the possibility for engaging these kinds of problems by bringing together people from very different domains who usually don't talk to each other. And so that was very special to me. I learned a lot from it. I enjoyed a lot, to have, a farmer here, to have a young politician from Eastern Europe who's established her own political party, to have somebody from the Pirates Party from Iceland, to have somebody who had participated in politics in Greece, to have somebody who's a poet. I had been wondering ahead of time sort of what is a poet-writer doing here, and then as soon as she was here and she was starting to explain what she brings to it, it became really, really clear how necessary she was in relation to questions of how do you create a narrative, how do you take audience into account. So as you see, I could keep going on. So this is just the beginning, right? But this is the tip of the iceberg, and of some of the things that I already was finding very exciting. So, so I found it exhausting, but not as exhausting as some people, in the sense that I'm used to being intellectually active 24 hours a day, essentially, or I sleep 4 hours, so say 20 hours a day. So that factor, right, was just sort of very normal for me, and I heard other people saying it was a bit different from what they were used to. I should also mention a wonderful engineer who is fantastic at getting people to talk about their feelings, and he brought that into the mix. But also talked about how tiring it was at a certain point to just be functioning intellectually and much less physically and with those other aspects. Food was delicious. I think that's an important component, right? You're laughing off camera here, but this is an important component, is the food was great. I thought that was a really nice aspect. The setting was very important. It was special to be in Barcelona, special to be in this environment. And then if I start shifting, and the final thing I think would be that I was very interested in specifically how does this process work itself, whose name I always turn into a different name. I'm thinking Syntegrity. What is it?
Syntegrity.
Syntegrity. Yeah, yeah. So the Synta thing, as soon as I saw the word, and I didn't recognize it, so a form of cybernetics, say, a form of applied cybernetics, maybe. I started being a good academic. I started reading up on it and stuff. I was really fascinated. I want to see also what I can take from that for when I'm teaching. And I've learned a number of different things that I think are going to be very useful when I'm trying to also get my students to think differently and to feel engaged and to work with each other, not just individually and stuff. Okay, then at the same time, I think that the process of talking as a group, what I noticed was that structurally there was a really strong sense of pressure. Some of the pressure is very much intended by that process to, at certain moments, shift us from just sort of talking in a freewheeling fashion to start making decisions by, for example, developing a statement. But other forms of pressure ended up having sort of the effect of feeling like they were disruptive in forcing people to stop talking just at the moment that they really needed to go further, right? So you don't know where that moment is going to come in the conversation, because you don't yet have control of the conversation enough to ensure that you've sort of talked about the necessary things at the moment you need to come to a decision. And you also don't know when the bell is going to ring, right? So that really, really could be happening at an important moment. And that when that moment is not completed, that also means that something doesn't happen. And I'm sure, this is a system that's been developed over years and years and years, so I'm sure this happens over and over. But I was very ambivalent about that aspect. And particularly because my understanding is the workshop has been brought back from 5 days to 3.5. I fully understand the practical consequences, but there are a number of people I talked to who said really this needs to be 5 days. So I think that there is perhaps work that could be done in tweaking how the process works now, to maybe still keep it 3.5 days, but somehow relieve some of the pressure that isn't working. Because I'd have to be off camera and sort of think through it a little bit more about why didn't it work and when didn't it work. But I really was registering that there were some moments when it wasn't working, even as there are other moments when it did work. That was one thing. Another thing is it became really clear, again, I think in this 3.5 days, how varied panels were relative to how diverse or similar people were. The more similarities people had, the easier it was for them to start having a conversation that was going to be productive. So I had actually underestimated how difficult it was to have a productive conversation among people who are coming from very different backgrounds, different professions, and then particularly when they had quite different personalities. So that you first had to spend so much time sort of engaging personality issues and conversational styles, then professional differences and background differences, so that by the time you finally were having a real conversation, that might be in only the last hour or two. And again, that's an issue for what you do when you bring it back from 5 days to 3.5. But I think that's something to think about. How can you tweak that, the similarity of a group relative to the diversity? Because both of them actually are enabling.
Just following on that,
Yeah.
it's called a form of non-hierarchical conferencing. Did you experience it as non-hierarchical?
Oh, I think that's a key point. And there's different ways to think about that. So one of the things, so that I don't forget, is it's non-hierarchical, and at the same time, even more, this was a gathering where we were supposed to be thinking about democracy, about strengthening democracy, right? So you have a lot of people who are very invested emotionally, intellectually, professionally in democracy, in thinking about it critically, in strengthening it, and so forth. And at moments with certain people, I could really see that coming into tension with the fact that the system of conversation is undemocratic, in the sense that we were told this is what we're going to be doing. And the moment that you stepped across the line in different kinds of ways, if you spoke when you shouldn't be speaking, if you came late or made noise, or you did various different things that violated the rules, right? You were very quickly, very strictly corrected and sort of brought back in line in a very undemocratic fashion. And in this setting, I think it would have been really useful to explain to participants how the organizers see the relation between having a commitment to democracy, where you also have people coming from various libertarian and anarchist and civil rights backgrounds, and then having a structure that is imposed at moments in a way that feels quite autocratic, right? It produces a tension, and I think that's not necessary if you're talking about something else, like, let's talk about the arts and culture, or let's talk about how to run a business, or, there's other sites it gets. But when this is the topic, and you have a format that's going against the topic in a way, and the intentions of the topic, I saw that was producing reactions by people that couldn't be expressed, that couldn't be incorporated, say, into what was going on. And that means that sometimes people would act out. So they might not come to a session where they are supposed to be a critic, or they might not participate actively when they might have participated more actively, or they might be a little bit rebellious or rude, or all the sort of passive aggressive ways we have of resisting systems that we accommodate ourselves to but aren't entirely persuaded by. So I was noticing that more, on sort of going into the second and third day. Okay, in terms of non-hierarchical, I think some of the times it was democratic, and then it really meant people searching. And what I noticed as somebody who was watching it was that I really had to learn to have more confidence in the democratic process of the conversation I was watching, where sometimes I really had a strong urge, I saw something not working, I wanted to solve it, and by stepping in. And then when I didn't step in, then I would see people solving it themselves, 5 minutes later or half an hour later. So that was a very important lesson for me to learn, is really to in this instance, let people sometimes solve it. I did notice on some panels that there was a very clear gender dynamic. The gender dynamic wasn't necessarily consistent throughout, say, even one group, but at certain moments it was very clear the conversations would be dominated by men who would be talking loudly. They would be moving their hands in large gestures that were reaching onto the table, right? Where the women would be quite accommodating. If they started to interrupt somebody, they would say sorry and they would quiet themselves. They would be taking notes. They might not say anything. Their body language was different. And when I spoke to the women afterwards, they were aware of it. So it was happening, and there was an awareness of it among some of the women, some of the time, right? Even as, a situation like that, right, say 10 minutes later, could shift as one of the men would turn to one of the women and say, well, you haven't been saying anything, what do you think about this or that? So there were correcting mechanisms, but at the same time, it didn't feel like it was enough addressed. And that seems like a complicated issue.
Any final thoughts?
I'm just starting. And then final thoughts. Okay, I love doing it. I'm really, really grateful that I had a chance to do it. Okay, the one you've already heard, just to get that one out, I wish it was 5 days instead of 3.5, though I also don't know if I could make the time commitment, but at the same time I wish it was that length. Address the discrepancy between taking democracy as a topic and then having an undemocratic sort of imposition of a structure. Safeguarding the downtimes. I was thinking that's always something that suffers. Any kind of event you go to, the breaks very often end up sort of suffering and being sacrificed. In this kind of setting, with this kind of thing, I think that simply can't happen. You have to find some way of safeguarding it, but the safeguarding can't happen by being even more strict with the timing of the conversations. Okay, so the strictness was already there. I don't think that was an issue. People were really doing their best to accommodate the strictness. Nonetheless, we get late, right? And I think somehow you have to build that in, that you're aware of, okay, we're going to be strict, yet we're going to be late. So we have to safeguard those downtimes in some different fashion, in addition to the strictness. Because, that was quite difficult. And I think people need that. They need that in all kinds of ways. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.